Chapter 6. The Roman Concept of Dominium. 1. The distinction between res Mancipi and res Nec Mancipi. To understand the Roman soul, you must understand their obsession with order, classification, and the soil. In the early Roman Republic, not all property was created equal. Romans divided the material world into two fundamental categories, res Mancipi and res Nec Mancipi. This wasn't mere academic distinction, it was a sacred hierarchy, reflecting the agricultural and military foundations of the Roman gens. Res Mancipi represented the noble property of the Roman citizen. It included land in Italy, slaves, beasts of burden, oxen and horses, rural servitudes. These were the essential instruments of a farmer-soldier's life. Because these items were considered the backbone of the state and family, they couldn't be sold or transferred lightly. The transfer of res Mancipi required a solemn public ritual, Mancipatio. In this ritual, parties appeared before 5 witnesses, adult Roman citizens, and a librepens, a scale holder. The purchaser would strike the scales with a piece of bronze, asserting his ownership in a prescribed verbal formula. This rigidity was a relic of the ancient communal era, a way for the community to witness and approve the movement of vital resources from one family to another, a formal barrier against alienation of ancestral heritage. On the other hand, res Nec Mancipi included everything else: clothes, gold, furniture, smaller animals like sheep or goats. These were considered lesser goods, could be transferred through simple delivery, traditio. They didn't define a man's standing in the census, they were merely commodities. The history of Roman law is the story of the eventual triumph of res Nec Mancipi over res Mancipi. As Rome transformed from a small agricultural community into a global mercantile empire, the cumbersome rituals of Mancipatio became an obstacle to trade. The sacred character of land and cattle began to fade, replaced by a more modern, fluid concept of property. However, this early distinction proves something. For the Romans, property was initially a public responsibility as much as a private right. The transition towards a world where everything could be sold as easily as a cloak was the first step towards commercialization of the world. This distinction was rooted in the religion of the hearth. The land, res Mancipi, was where family gods resided. It was mancipable because it was tied to the very identity of the Roman citizen. By the time this distinction was abolished, the spiritual bond between Roman and soil had already been severed by the cold logic of the market and the rise of the great slave estates. 2. The absolute authority of the master, Pater Familias. In the Roman legal mind, property wasn't a dispersed right shared among family members. It was a singular, absolute power concentrated in the hands of one man, the Pater Familias. This figure wasn't merely a father in the modern sense, he was the sovereign lord of a microstate known as the Familia. Under the doctrine of patria potestas, the Pater Familias held the power of life and death over his children, his wife if married under manus, his slaves. Ius vitae necisque, the right of life and death. In this rigid hierarchy, ownership and personhood were terrifyingly intertwined. To the Roman state, only the Pater Familias was a person with capacity to own property. Everything acquired by his sons, even as adults, or by his slaves, automatically fell into his Dominium. A son could lead an army or serve as a magistrate, but legally he couldn't own the shoes on his feet without his father's consent. This was the ultimate culmination of the patriarchal revolution. The ancient communal gens where wealth was shared and lineage followed the mother was completely inverted. Now the male head of the household was the sole funnel through which all wealth, land, and legal rights flowed. This absolute authority created a unique form of property known as the peculium. To allow the household to function, the Pater Familias would grant a peculium, a small portion of assets or money, to a son or slave to manage independently. However, legally, this remained the property of the father. He could revoke it at any moment. This system ensured the unity of the estate was never broken. While the Greek polis sought a balance of property among citizens, the Roman familia sought total concentration of property in a single hand. This domestic tyranny was the foundation of the Roman concept of dominium, the right to use, enjoy, and even destroy one's property. Jus utendi, fruendi, et abutendi. Because the Pater Familias had such absolute power over his living assets, his family, his power over his dead assets, his land and tools, became equally limitless. The land was no longer a communal trust for future generations. It was the personal kingdom of the master. This centralization of power was both the strength and curse of Rome. It allowed for massive accumulation of wealth and creation of a disciplined ruling class. But it also sowed seeds of social decay. When the father's authority eventually weakened in later centuries, the legal structures built to protect his absolute dominion remained, providing the blueprint for the modern concept of private property as an exclusive, exclusionary, and near sacred right of the individual. 3. Slavery as a property relation and the instrumentum vocale. In the Roman world, the concept of dominium reached its logical and most brutal conclusion in slavery. To the Roman jurist, a slave wasn't a person with limited rights, but a thing, res, that happened to be alive. This was famously codified in the agricultural treatises of Varro, who classified the tools of production into 3 categories. First, instrumentum vocale, the speaking tool, the slave. Second, instrumentum semivocale, the semi-articulate tool, the ox or cattle. Third, instrumentum mutum, the mute tool, the plow and cart. This classification wasn't a metaphor, it was the bedrock of Roman economic life. The slave was legally indistinguishable from a beast of burden or a piece of furniture. The slave owner's power over the slave was the ultimate expression of private property, the right to use, the right to the fruits of labor, the right to destroy. Because the slave was a commodity, they could be bought, sold, leased, or mortgaged, just like a plot of land or a sack of grain. The transformation of humans into instrumentum vocale was the engine of the Roman Latifundia, the great estates. As Rome conquered the Mediterranean, hundreds of thousands of captives flooded into Italy. This human capital allowed wealthy aristocracy to abandon the old system of small-scale free farming and replace it with massive industrial-scale agriculture. Unlike the free kinsmen of the ancient gens, the slave had no connection to the soil they tilled. They were a mobile, disposable asset. This system fundamentally altered the Roman soul's relationship with labor. Work, which had once been a civic duty of the free soldier-citizen, became servile. Because labor was performed by speaking tools, it was seen as beneath the dignity of a free man. This led to a fatal economic contradiction. The Roman economy became entirely dependent on a form of property that required constant warfare to replenish. Slaves didn't reproduce efficiently under such conditions, and constant violence to maintain. Furthermore, the legal treatment of the slave as property created complex juridical puzzles. If a slave committed a crime, was it the thing that was guilty, or was the owner liable for damage caused by his property? Roman law developed the noxal surrender, where an owner could either pay for damages or simply hand over the slave, the thing, to the victim. This reinforced the idea that the slave was an extension of the owner's estate, no different from a dog that bites or a tree that falls on a neighbor's fence. Slavery was the ultimate test of the concept of dominium. 4. The rise of the Latifundia and the ruin of the free peasantry. The tragedy of Roman property is summed up in a famous sentence by Pliny the Elder. Latifundia perdidere Italiam. The great estates have ruined Italy. This stage marks the moment when the balance of property was permanently shattered. The small independent farmsteads that had produced the legendary legions of the early Republic were systematically devoured by massive slave-run plantations owned by the senatorial aristocracy. This was the triumph of concentrated capital over communal and small-scale survival. The process of this ruin began with Rome's endless wars of conquest. While the free peasant soldier was away fighting in Carthage or Macedonia, his small plot of land fell into neglect. Upon his return, he often found himself unable to compete with the sheer economic power of the wealthy elite, who would use the spoils of war to buy up vast tracts of the ager publicus, the public land. Theoretically, this land belonged to the Roman people, but in practice, the powerful used legal loopholes and political influence to treat it as their private dominium. This was a cannibalistic economic model. The wealthy didn't just buy land, they bought human tools, slaves, to work it. A slave-run latifundium could produce grain, oil, and wine at a cost the free peasant could never match. The peasant had to support a family and serve in the army. The small farmer was caught in a pincer movement. On one side, burdened by taxes and military service; on the other, his products devalued by the slave economy. One by one, the small fences of the peasants were torn down to make way for the endless pastures and vineyards of the lords. This shift transformed the very nature of Italian soil. The countryside was cleansed of its free population. The displaced peasants flocked to Rome, forming a volatile, landless proletariat that lived on state-subsidized grain. Property had become so concentrated that the state no longer had a stable base of soldier citizens to draw from. The land was now owned by a few hundred families who lived in luxury in the city, while the work was done by shackled gangs of foreigners who had no love for the Roman state. This concentration of land was the primary driver of the Gracchan reforms, a desperate and ultimately failed attempt to redistribute the ager publicus and recreate a class of smallholders. The failure of these reforms proved something. Once private property reaches a certain level of concentration, it becomes stronger than the state itself. The latifundia weren't just farms, they were internal colonies that sucked the life out of the republic, leading directly to the rise of military dictatorships and the eventual internal collapse of the empire. Property had become a monster that, in its pursuit of absolute growth, consumed the social foundations that protected it. 5. The transition from slave labor to colonnatus, the seeds of serfdom. As the ancient Roman Empire entered its long twilight, the absolute concept of dominium faced a terminal economic crisis. The great Latifundia, which had relied on a constant supply of cheap slaves from conquest, began to fail, as imperial borders stabilized and the supply of human tools dried up. Furthermore, slave labor was notoriously inefficient. A man treated as a speaking tool had no incentive to care for the land or improve his tools. To save the declining agricultural economy, the Roman elite were forced to invent a new form of property relation, the colonnatus. In this system, the vast estates were broken into smaller plots and leased to coloni, free peasants or manumitted slaves who were allowed to live on the land and keep a portion of the harvest for themselves, in exchange for a fixed rent or labor services. However, this wasn't a return to the old freedom. To ensure tax revenues remained stable and the land remained cultivated, the Roman state enacted laws that bound the colonnatus to the soil. The colonnatus was legally free in his person, but he was a slave of the land. He couldn't leave his plot, and if the land was sold, the colonnatus was sold along with it. This transition marks a fundamental shift in the nature of property. The absolute ownership of the person, slavery, was evolving into a qualified ownership of labor, serfdom. The Pater Familias was transforming into the dominus, a lord who no longer owned the body of the worker, but possessed a legal right to his life's work. The colonnatus was the bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds. It reconciled the private ownership of the aristocracy with the necessity of keeping the worker attached to the means of production. The legal status of the colonnatus was the first step toward the feudalization of Europe. The state, unable to manage its vast territory, essentially outsourced its authority to the great landowners. The landlord became the judge, the protector, the tax collector for the colony living on his estate. Property was no longer just a right to an object, it became a right to a social hierarchy. The common people who had once been co-owners of the tribal gens were now permanently anchored to a piece of ground they didn't own, serving a master who held their destiny in his ledgers. By the time the Germanic tribes crossed the frontiers of the empire, they didn't find a society of free citizens, but a landscape of tied workers and powerful magnates. The Roman dominion had reached its limit, and in its struggle to survive had planted the seeds of the feudal manor. The absolute private property of the ancient world was dying, giving way to the conditional property of the Middle Ages, where every piece of land would eventually be bound by a chain of duties, from the lowest serf to the highest king.